I'm honoured to be asked to take part in this particular series of talks, which I see is mostly made up of much more important lectures than myself. Thank you for arranging some Icelandic weather tonight to make me feel at home, but that was maybe one kindness that I could have done without. I'm going to talk for a long time tonight. I'm allowed to speak for more than an hour, which is a great luxury for a lecturer. If I see most of the audience going to sleep, I will try to speak a little bit more loudly. And if you see me going to sleep, perhaps somebody could cough or something so that we could continue. Now, as you see, my lecture is focusing on one of the frontiers of Europe, Europe's northern frontier, which tonight we define as the Arctic frontier, although there are other terms we could have used. We could talk about the high northern frontier. And by the time I'd finished preparing for this talk, I thought that the subject is actually even more interesting if you slightly rearrange it and define it as the Arctic considered as a European frontier or considered as part of Europe, and that an important clue to understanding what is happening in the Arctic may be provided by looking at it in that way. And to show you what I mean, I'll begin with this image. Now, since the international interest has risen in the Arctic at diplomatic level, at economic level, at academic level, it has become very fashionable or even compulsory to start off with a circumpolar map, so that your attention is drawn to the importance of the polar region. You see the way the countries are clustered around, you get an idea of the distances involved. Well, that's useful for those limited purposes, but I think it's actually a misleading image in several ways, or at least in the way that people often use it. Because it suggests that the Arctic is a separate, clearly defined zone. It suggests that it is a unitary zone, that the whole area inside or around the Arctic Circle has some things in common. It makes it look very solid. Now, of course, it's not solid because that white space is all ice. There is only sea underneath, not continent as there is in Antarctica. And as we know, the ice is rapidly melting. But just as important is the fact that the Arctic is not a separate or somehow virginal space. Mankind has been living there for at least 10,000 years, and to me the definition of virginity is not where a man has been for 10,000 years. With all the violence and trading and all the other things that go with that. And it is certainly not a unitary space, but there are big differences between the different subzones of the Arctic in terms of natural habitats, climate conditions, but above all in the nature of human presence, human occupation, political characteristics, and governance, and especially the presence or absence of competent institutions. And if we're going to understand the truth about the Arctic, by all means, let's have that map, but let's also have this traditional map, because it shows us the Arctic as part of the global picture. It just happens to be at the northern extremity of the world, but it is a full participant in globalization. It is affected by globalization, and things happening up there also help to drive global processes. Just to give you the most absolutely obvious example, that is the example of climate change. Climate change in the Arctic, as we will see in a moment, is a rapid and important process, but it is mostly driven by emissions and things going on outside the Arctic zone. The Arctic peoples couldn't produce enough carbon to induce these changes on their own, even if they tried. But conversely, what happens in the Arctic could affect the rest of the world quite seriously. For example, if the melting of the ice causes rises in sea level, the latest models show that sea level within the Arctic zone would not change so much, but the extra water would be pushed downwards to drown the coastlines elsewhere in the world. If the Arctic gets really warm, possibly the circulation of the Gulf Stream up from the Caribbean towards our regions here would weaken or even stop, and we would suddenly find ourselves in another ice age. I could mention other ways where the Arctic is part of global processes. Perhaps the most important one to bear in mind for our topic today is the global energy economy, where Arctic resources could be an important input to the global energy economy for good or ill, but only if the global energy economy wants them. And that may not be very obviously the case just now. Also part of the truth is this map, where you see the Arctic as the northern extremity of Europe, and you can see that quite a lot of Europe lies in or lies very close to the Arctic. Even if you define it in the strictest terms, which we usually don't, but if you define it in the strictest terms of the Arctic Circle, you may not see the Arctic Circle very clearly here, but it runs just over the north of Iceland, and then it takes in a very large part of the Scandinavian peninsula, parts of Norway, Sweden and Finland. It takes in very large parts of northwestern Russia. And there are many, many Europeans living and considering that they live perfectly normal lives in those Arctic frontier zones of Europe. And if we were to draw a map of human presence and human activity, and even if we went back 500-600 years, you would see all kinds of red lines on this map of people coming out from Scandinavia and Russia, trading down into Europe, people going up there to trade, Arctic products being brought down to the Black Sea, which was happening already in Viking times. And then you would see from the Western European nations, Britain, Spain, France, sailors going up to those areas and going very, very far up to seek seals, whales, and various kinds of fish. So the European connection is there. It's a human connection. It's an economic connection, not merely a climatic or geographical connection. And it has existed for a very long time. And that's why I think it is certainly worthwhile and interesting to think of the Arctic as a frontier of Europe. And I see it myself as one of three main frontiers, although in your lecture series you may be able to break them down into more than three, all of which have a slightly different mix of characteristics. On the east, the asymmetrical power of the Russian Federation looms especially high. The countries have problems, and problems in integrating themselves in the larger European movement, not just because of Russia, but also because of relatively low gross domestic product and other issues of development, maybe underdevelopment. On the southern frontier, you don't have another great power looming over us like Russia. Arguably, Europe is the largest strategic power within reach of Northern Europe, Northern Africa, I should say. But the countries there are even poorer, and it is a very open question whether they could ever be part of the European integration process in the normal sense. Now, in the north, you get a very different and intriguing mixture. Strategically, it's asymmetrical because Russia is still up there. It's a huge presence. About half of the Arctic is actually Russian. Well, we often forget that. And it does loom over the Nordic countries, who, all five of them put together, have only a fraction of the military power of Russia. But they all have very much higher GDPs than Russia, and social standards and capacity for innovation, capacity for partnership. And the relationship up there is asymmetrical in a different way, in that the Nordic countries are trying to help northwest Russia with its development. The flow of aid and of influence is very much from west to east, and that is, of course, primarily because these are rich countries. At the same time, they are only semi-integrated in the big European process, because, as you know, Finland, Sweden are members of the EU. Denmark is, but with some opt-outs. Norway and Iceland are, quotes, only in the European Economic Area. Although I should not really stress the only, since that does mean that they share in huge quantities of single market regulation, and they often share also the external policies of the EU by opting in. But it's still quite striking that if you took 5 countries anywhere else in the well-developed part of Europe, to find 2 that have voluntarily stayed out of the EU would be quite unusual. And Denmark's territories of the Greenland and Faroes have also stayed out. So this is an area of semi-integration, or you could fairly even call it limited integration. And that's a very interesting kind of frontier, I think, politically and institutionally. Now, what I'm going to do in the rest of the lecture is to talk about what is changing in the Arctic, what is this famous process of Arctic change, and how much do we know, or how much is still uncertain. What does this mean prima facie for Europe in general? At this point, still talking about Europe rather than the EU. What are the different ways that Europe and Europeans can be involved? Some remarks on the governance framework in the region, because I think there are often misunderstandings about that. And then I will talk briefly about the involvement of the European Union as such, again with a kind of theme of myths and realities. And some very short final thoughts where I will come back to the question of seeing this as one of Europe's frontiers and discussing how is it tied up with the ultimate fate or finality of Europe. Now, here I'll go into the part about Arctic myths and realities, things that we know and things that we don't know. We do know that of all the parts of the world, the Arctic is the most hit by global warming. The dark red colours on here are where we're seeing the most rapid temperature rises, and an over-average temperature rise is forecast to continue in some, although not all, parts of the Arctic. You can maybe see that there is a white area around the North Atlantic, which is the European gateway to the Arctic, and it's actually not rising as fast there as elsewhere. As a consequence, the sea ice is dropping. You see here the curve of the coverage of sea ice from the beginning of the year down to July, and one of the things wrong with this picture is that it reaches its lowest level in September. And this September, the amount of sea ice has been less than in any previous year. What is wrong with this picture is that we might assume, okay, no ice, therefore we're going to be able to go in and do what we want. Where there is no ice, we can simply make an oil well and get out the oil. And here I speak not as a trained economist, but with the authority of the World Economic Forum, the Davos process, where we find many of the best economic and business brains in the world. They have this short but very good publication available online called Demystifying the Arctic, where they try to knock down 5 myths about the Arctic. And one of the myths is the Arctic will become immediately accessible as sea ice continues to disappear. Well, they're right in saying that that's a myth. And why is it a myth? Well, first of all, the sea ice is not melting at the same rate everywhere. Its hardest surviving part seems to be to the north and northeast of Greenland, which pretty much lies in the way of sailing directly over the North Pole. And I'll come back later to the shipping routes. As the ice melts, there will be more icebergs. Remember the Titanic? As the water gets warmer, there will be more fog. There are some parts of the Canadian route, the Northwest Passage, that already have fog for 85% of the year. And as the water warms, it could be 100% of the year, which is not very good for shipping either. So the conditions are going to get more difficult, more risky, with more extremes of weather, winds, currents, characteristics of the sea water, and many other things. In fact, it would be more correct to say that as the ice retreats on land, it will in many cases be quicker and easier to exploit it. And the best informed experts say that if we want to look for new economic activity in the next 5 to 10 years, maybe we should be looking at mining on land. And although there has been a huge controversy over new mines in Greenland, none have actually started there yet. In fact, some projects have closed down. Whereas if you take the whole Arctic, there are already 88 mining projects and apparently 800 being considered. So mining is not a Greenland issue, it's an issue for the whole of the Arctic, and it might have considerable potential, but note the next point, that as the land warms up, the permafrost, that is the reliable frozen area of land, where all the oil wells stand in Russia. I mean, Russia has huge numbers of roads, railways, towns, cities, and oil wells built on this frost. It all risks sinking into the mud. And it will, by the way, release huge bubbles of methane, which will speed up the local rise in temperature. And with all this, we don't know if the rise in temperature will continue exactly as now. It's possible that there will be fluctuations. And in fact, at the moment, we are in a cold fluctuation. After that, it might be relatively faster in the increase. So we're looking at a very unstable situation. Now, oil and natural gas in the Arctic, the grey patches on here show you where it is. Don't worry too much about the text there. But altogether, the US Geographical Survey some years ago claimed that 30% of the world's undiscovered gas and 15% of the undiscovered oil is in those grey patches that you can see on that map. Now, funnily enough, somebody from the US National Geographic Survey told me that when they made that statement, they wanted to highlight that it was only 30% of the gas and only 15% of the oil. And they were trying to make the point that there is actually a great deal more than that still hidden underneath the Arab world and Central Asia and parts of Africa and Latin America, where it's much easier to get at. And also, is the market interested in going for these completely unconfirmed, completely unknown resources where you have to go through all the trouble of exploration and trial drilling and very heavy capital investment before the first drop of oil or gas comes out? Well, as we know at the moment, because of the big boom in shale oil and gas and because of other economic and geopolitical trends, gas prices are particularly low and oil prices are relatively low. And the industry does not seem at the moment in very much of a hurry to explore these areas. Some projects are going forward, yes, but others have been put on hold, for example, off Norway. Also important when you look at these grey areas is that they're all within the jurisdictions of countries. There's no doubt about who this oil and gas belongs to. If it was right in the middle over the North Pole, then we wouldn't at the moment know who it belongs to. But these are within or just beyond existing exploitation regions belonging to states, and it's clear who will give the licenses for development of this. There's really not a lot of chance of conflict over this. I will go on quickly to this next map, which doesn't seem to be there. Oh. That's a bit funny. Maybe it doesn't matter, I'll just go on talking. What this map would have shown you is 3 Arctic shipping routes, looking at them with the North Pole at the centre. There is the Northwest Passage over Canada. There is the Northern Sea route over Siberia, over Russian territory and coming up around the top of Norway. And then on the map, there is one route which is painted in, going straight over the North Pole. And I was going to ask you what was wrong with that picture. You won't make the mistake because you can't see it. But many people make the mistake of thinking that these are 3 existing routes and that they are all equally open. And that is very, very far from the truth. The one that is open and is now being used by hundreds of vessels every year is the one over Russia. But many of those ships are going from Russia to Russia. The number of ships that are actually going all the way between the Pacific and Atlantic is still relatively small. The Northwest Passage is still mostly closed. We still hear about individual ships making the experiment, but it is very hard. And the polar route is effectively closed. A Chinese icebreaker has gone over there in September with minimum ice, with very strong icebreaking capacity, but it's not a place where you would send a normal transport vessel or a tourist ship for a long time yet. And the routes are very different in the question of who controls them, what are the attitudes of the people who control them, and hence what are, if you like, the human risks and the human costs. Again, the mere fact that there are routes doesn't mean that the private sector wants to use them. The question is, what is the relative benefit of doing so? And although it's often pointed out that they are shorter, that you can save some days, well, for many kinds of cargoes, the days don't really matter. Or at least you can plan them in such a way that the days don't really matter. And the fact is that the other factors, other than time, the other costs are still extremely high and uncertain, even for the Northern Sea route, which has become relatively easy. That's partly because insurance costs are twice as high as on any other long-range route. So it costs less to go through the Malacca Strait with all its pirates, or less to go through the Suez Canal with all the trouble in the Arab world. It still costs only half as much to go through there as to go around the north of Russia. And then the Russians insist that all ships, even if they have icebreaking capacity, are accompanied by an independent Russian icebreaker. And of course, they have to pay for that. Of course, if you built more ships with icebreaking capacity, you could use it more. It could become more profitable if you could start getting goods through in bulk. But building those kinds of ships costs a lot of money. And would you build them if you weren't absolutely sure that there will be enough cargoes wanted on that route and that the costs will drop down? At the moment, companies are not sure that the cargoes are there and not sure that the costs will drop down. And what they all have to think about is not only the costs but the risks, because even the Northern Sea route takes something like 7 days in the best of conditions. It goes over virtual uninhabited territory. There is very little in the way of on-land facilities. The Russians are building 2 new bases in the most remote area, but that still falls quite short of what a shipping line would normally expect, so that there would be capacity to come and help if it got into trouble, or indeed if it caused an oil spill, that there would be people who could come and clean that up for the sake of the environment. That is very doubtful for the great majority of the potential routes at present. Now, you will hear a lot about Arctic territorial claims and potential conflicts, and this is a beautiful, colourful map from the University of Durham, which shows existing jurisdictions and then crisscrossing claims that are made by people, particularly those who would like to extend their economic zones across the North Pole. And it is mainly Russia, Norway, Canada, and Denmark who are claiming that. Does it actually matter? Is this a potential source of... is it of economic importance? Is it of security importance? Well, since we don't know of any oil and gas deposits in the close central polar zone, it is a matter of political symbolism, I would say, rather than something that definitely has a strong economic motivation at the moment. Many of the remaining disputes are in fact between Western states, like one that lawyers love to tell you about between Denmark and Canada in the northwest of Greenland. There's a little island called Hans Island. But is it worth spending your time listening to that? Is there a chance that Denmark and Canada will go to war over it? Well, I think the chances are actually very low. And we should not spend too much time. Well, you can go to a separate legal conference and hear about this in huge detail, but I would not suggest it's worth worrying a great deal about it tonight. And that's also because in 2008 at Ilulissat in Greenland, the 5 countries who are actually making the claims, or which have the potential claims, that is, the ones who have territories above the Arctic Circle, made a statement that they will pursue their claims in a legal and peaceful manner. We know that the US is not party to the UN Law of the Sea, which is the main basis for adjudicating these claims, but it has said many times that it will act as if it is a party to UNLOSC in terms of the restraints and legal disciplines that that imposes. Now, some people say, OK, disregard all that. People might still go to war because they're all building up their militaries up there, and there might be some crazy captains of these ships who like to fight just for the sake of it, or there might be some sort of military accident or something. Well, the so-called militarization of the Arctic can be greatly exaggerated. For those of you who are more interested in this, I give you this slide, where on the left-hand side you have some of the main known facts about military increases. By the way, the US is making no military increases at all. It's just making some fairly feeble moves for better coordination. So there doesn't seem to be a superpower arms race up there, unless you count Canada as the superpower opposite Russia. And when you look on the right-hand side at the general military forces or the general increase in militarization, it seems to me that the effort being made in the Arctic is not actually very great. And if you look at it in greater detail, many of it is just replacing or updating existing assets. And I can show you a quotation from SIPRI. This was a report written in 2012 by an excellent Dutch expert who is one of the most anti-militaristic people in SIPRI, and good for him, I would say. But his conclusion was that many of these new acquisitions were being got to deal with territorial patrolling, law enforcement, fisheries protection, search and rescue, not for fighting other people. And his overall judgment was that these were modest increases, and as it says in this text, conventional military forces specially adapted to the harsh Arctic environment are projected to remain small scale. If I worry about anything up there, I worry more about the fact that there is no arms control system for the Arctic, and there are no confidence or security building measures, especially designed for the Arctic. Some of those from the OSCE system apply in areas just off the European coast. So here too, Europe is a bit more organised than other parts of the Arctic, but there is nothing for the whole Arctic space, and I think we could definitely discuss whether there should be. Now we come to human and social and environmental problems, and here you get the kind of pictures that you will see in many talks about the Arctic. I actually promised myself 5 years ago that I would never use a picture of an unhappy polar bear in one of my lectures. But in this case, I'm showing you that, and I'm showing you a picture of a reindeer herder in northeast Siberia to make the point that there is something wrong with these pictures. They are not typical of the human reality. And possibly they don't even represent the main threat to natural systems and to human social systems above the Arctic Circle. And why not? Well, here I have a quote from a leader of the indigenous peoples, so I'm not trying to contradict the importance of the native peoples or those who are living natural lives. But he is telling us about the diversity of the Arctic, and he points out that there are settlements ranging from small communities to modern industrial cities. And he tells us that the indigenous peoples altogether, if you count the wider Arctic population, that is, if you go down beyond the Arctic Circle into regions that have the same physical characteristics, like central Siberia or greater parts of Canada or the whole of Iceland, you can add up to about 10 million people. And out of those, 1.5 million at the most, or 15%, are indigenous peoples. Within the Arctic Circle properly defined, there are about 5 million people and about 500,000 indigenous peoples, so the proportion is even longer. And that the region includes modern formal economies. And just to be a bit provocative and just to give you a bit of a contrast, here we are in Iceland, hanging just under the Arctic Circle. Friday night, a shopping mall, fashionable young women in up-to-date clothes, eating Subways, and if you could see just to the right, you would see that a lot of them are eating sushi. So this is the global, modern, industrialised, urbanised Arctic. And this is what is typical. So you may think my point is provocative or counterintuitive, but just take a look at these numbers. You've got 3 cities above the Arctic Circle, with populations of around 300,000. And you can go on down from that, the nearest capitals, Reykjavik, Nuuk in Greenland. And not only are these quite sizable numbers of people, but in the summer, many of them are multiplied through tourism. Iceland has 1/3 of a million. It has 3 million travellers going through it every year. And if we're worried about human safety or human conditions up there, we should think about the tourists as well, who are often less familiar with the environment and less protected. Now, for all the people, whether they're living natural lives with dog sleds or in tiny villages, or whether they're living in large, crumbling post-industrial cities like Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, they are going to find their way of life changing. Climate change alone is changing the way of life for all of them. For the first time, issues of food safety are raised in the Arctic. You used to be able to just leave your shopping outside your front door and everything would stay safely frozen for 7 months of the year. Now, if you buy it in Reykjavik and put it in the back of your car and forget about it for 4 hours, a lot of the meat will have gone off by the time that you get it home. So everybody, what kind of life they're leading, whatever kind of life they're leading, is affected by climate change. It will give new economic opportunities, but it will make demands for these people, all of these people, to adapt if they are going to come out on balance with profit rather than damage. Because there will be damage, there will be accidents, there will be natural disasters, there will be loss of livelihood because of climate change. And they will have to face new health risks as the climate warms up, and they will have to deal with migration patterns. There is local migration as people who have depended on the ice or lived on the edge of the ice find that the ice isn't there anymore, and they have to migrate either to colder regions or into cities. There is international migration coming in as companies doing large infrastructure projects bring international specialised workforces with them. Not in order to be nasty, not because they're irresponsible, but because the labour simply is not available locally. So more of that is going to happen. And I am among those who would say that all this development, all this migration, all this human and societal change is not necessarily evil in itself. People in the Arctic have been adapting throughout the 10,000 years that they have lived there. People everywhere, including in Brussels, are having to adapt to new climatic or social or economic conditions. The question is who controls the adaptation and who decides. Do the local people have enough say, and do they have enough ownership of the processes by which decisions are taken, whether they're institutional, commercial, or national political decisions? And I think you would find that the answer to that actually varies all the way around the Arctic. And there are indeed parts of the Arctic where the indigenous people have rights guaranteed under international law to have a say, for instance, in major economic contracts or development schemes. But the ordinary people living in the cities don't, which is quite interesting. Now, I come to the halfway stage in the talk. I hope you're still with me. And I would like to move to the European part of my theme. What happens if we look at this through European eyes? Well, first of all, I think I can prove through this slide that it is an issue for Europe, and that it's an issue for Europe in many different ways. Now, most obviously, it affects those states who have all or part of their territory in the High North, which is the Nordic states and their autonomous territories. Europeans from other states can also be highly active in Arctic research and in monitoring and surveillance. I guess of those of you who are sitting here tonight, most of your countries are taking part in that, and certainly the European Union is. And then in individual branches of the Arctic economy, you will have many Europeans involved, physically because they are directly taking part in shipping. Bear in mind that a lot of the ships that go through the Arctic are insured within Europe or flagged within Europe or in European colonies. There are the big oil and gas companies and mining companies, often based in Europe, or consortia which have European partners. There is fishing, of course, a huge European fishing enterprise up there. There's some statistic about the percentage of Arctic fish which is eaten in Europe, and I don't have it in my mind, but it's a high percentage and always has been very high. But also bear in mind that there are Europeans who may never physically go up there, but are taking very significant economic decisions through decisions whether to invest or not, through banking and finance and insurance, through legal consultancy and business consultancy in general. There are very few of the big European banks and legal consultancies that are not starting to get involved somehow in Arctic business. Then, of course, as I already mentioned in the case of fishing, we are big consumers. Europe buys most of Norway's oil and, of course, quite a good deal of Russian oil extracted in the High North, and Russian gas extracted in the High North finds its way into Europe. And there can often be quite heavy European dependency on that. Europeans go up there as tourists and they go up there as transit passengers. quite a lot of the 3 million who go through Keflavik airport in Iceland every year are in fact using a cheap way to go to the United States, and they depend on that. When recently a volcanic eruption broke out at a place called Hólakróin, which is right in the middle of Iceland, as remote as it could be, they had to ask aeroplanes not to fly directly over it, at least not at below 30,000 meters. No Icelandic flights were involved because they all tend to go directly south from the island, but 30 different international airlines would have flown over Hólakróin on their long-distance flights before they were warned not to do so. Then you have people who care about the Arctic, and you could be living somewhere at the other end. I mean, you could be living in Serbia or in Portugal or in Malta, and you could care about the polar bears or the whales or the reindeer or something else. Or you could not want oil and gas mining to go forward. You could be a Greenpeace activist. So I think there are a lot of people who are, so to speak, morally engaged here within Europe. And last but not least, everybody who is affected in any way by climate change will be affected by those those influences coming back on us from the Arctic, particularly with sea level, patterns of winds and winter storms. I mean, probably this storm tonight would not be so bad if it was not for Arctic warming. There is a chain of causation that you can see there. So Europe has many people involved, and I would argue that it also has a number of stakes and interests which are very straightforward. And this table tries to summarise them, so I'm not going to talk it through in too much detail. I hope this is fairly straightforward. We would all suffer, not just Northern Europe, if there was war in the Arctic. Bear in mind that the only people who could fight up there are Russia and the others are all in NATO. You may be able to construct a scenario where Russia and Canada fight in the Arctic and it doesn't lead to World War III. I find that personally quite difficult to believe. And I have written an article trying to think the unthinkable and trying to think through those scenarios. And I see a very large risk that war in the Arctic would escalate to affect the rest of us. We therefore want peace, and peace that can be relied on, because if we want to make investments, if we want to build up new economic relationships, we have to know that it's sustainable over time. Any development there must be responsible and sustainable, but frankly, we also want it to be profitable over time. And we can only be sure of that if we can exclude conflict. If we can avoid war, and if we can avoid war spreading to the Arctic, we could perversely argue that the common interests that we have up there with Russia, and I will come to the institutional part of that shortly, but the fact that we have nothing obvious to fight over up there with Russia. We have a growing Chinese interest, and we have nothing obvious up there on which we might want to fight with China either. That possibly, if those common interests become sustainable and profitable and institutionalized, it could even have the opposite effect. Instead of war escalating to Europe, you might have some kind of spirit of Arctic cooperation that would escalate down here as well. Clearly, it matters whether we can control climate, and that we must do through our own actions. No point asking the Greenlanders to cut their emissions. We do not want economic damage and disruption. We don't want the old economic way of life to be broken down by climate change and social and political unrest that might flow from that before we have managed to build up some kind of new economic profile there that keeps the people alive, keeps them fed, gives them jobs, gives them some sort of local pride and some kind of local ownership. Because let's bear in mind that if people are starving in Ethiopia, the whole international development system is mobilized to help them. Can you imagine development aid being channeled to northern Canada or even northern Russia? That's not within our concept of where the aid goes. But there may at least locally be people whose problems would actually deserve it if you applied those criteria. There is also a larger issue for Europe. Will it let the Arctic divide Europe, or will it let the Arctic unite Europe? And I just mentioned that as a teaser because I'm going to come back to that in my very last point. But before that, I would like to say a bit. I hope I'm not drawing down too much on your patience here, but this is an aspect that really interests me, is thinking about governance in the Arctic. And to be honest, particularly if you're new to this subject, I would say there is a lot of nonsense spoken and written about Arctic governance. It's one of those areas where it's really important for you to know very important to know what you should not believe. First of all, and it's also the first myth of the World Economic Forum, don't believe that this is a lawless space. Don't believe that this is a no man's land. There are all kinds of global mechanisms and conventions and legal frameworks, which I will come to in a moment. And precisely because it is a sea surrounded by countries, and those countries have lands reaching far up into the Arctic, and they all have declared 200-mile extended economic zones, or the US has the equivalent, a great part of the Arctic territory is under long-standing national jurisdiction. And none of the states are weak states, right? So, I mean, there's no risk of them falling subject to civil war or having NGOs capture their policies or having terrorists break up their policies. There is a solid base of interlocking national jurisdiction up there with several layers of international law on top of it. And that is why, if you dream about an Arctic treaty like the Antarctic Treaty, if you dream about an Arctic zone where there would be no nasty economic activity and polar bears would roam free and there would be no military activity, I'm afraid you have to destroy that dream. Because none of the nations up there will ever sign an Arctic treaty. And actually most of the indigenous peoples don't want an Arctic treaty, and certainly none of the businesses want an Arctic treaty. And it would be a very undemocratic world, it seems to me, that could impose such a treaty on a set of mainly responsible, strong, sovereign nation states who are actually not doing too badly because they have kept the Arctic peaceful even through the Cold War and right up to date. So what do we actually have there in way of governance if we look more closely at what is really there? Well, I like to pose the question, is it typical of the European security architecture? That's an interesting question which researchers haven't really posed yet. I'm hoping actually to be able to write an article about this afterwards, since your topic tonight brought it to my mind more clearly than before. Now, there are some things that are not typical of European security architecture, because generally in Europe we do not think of the United Nations or the agencies or the instruments of the United Nations as being the primary basis of our security, as you would think if you were in probably the Caribbean or the Pacific or various parts of Africa. The Arctic zone does abnormally rely on certain UN instruments, despite the fact that the UN has never discussed this in the Security Council. It's not really on the security or political agenda, but the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is the very basis for the great majority of activity that goes on there, for the system of licensing, for example, and for the future resolution of these territorial claims. The International Maritime Organization already has a number of legal instruments and standards that apply to Arctic shipping, and it has just about finished negotiating a new polar code for shipping, which will impose stronger security standards and environmental standards. And the hope is that that will be open for signature next year. Now, of course, the beauty of having these aspects looked after by the UN globally is that anyone who wants to come into the area or invest in the area, come in as a tourist or whatever may be, will be able to join into these legal frameworks, observe them, and have equal rights under them. And this is very important for external countries that want to play a role: China, Japan, India, and so forth. But a couple of other things are actually perfectly normal if we think about the periphery of Europe. Now, people find it very hard to understand the role of NATO up there, because on the one hand you have Canada, which for several years has been saying NATO isn't allowed to have an Arctic strategy. The Arctic countries can look after it. And you have Russia saying, as one of their people did just a few days ago, there is no place for NATO in the Arctic. At the same time, you have several million people living in Iceland, northern Norway, who believe that they are members of NATO and believe that their territory is covered by Article 5, and indeed their coastal waters are covered by Article 5, and that NATO would come and rescue them if they were attacked, just as it would rescue Estonia or Romania or, Brussels, anybody. Both these things are true, and if you think of this as a peripheral area, I think you get the point. Because NATO's practice is not to have great big multilateral bases around its peripheries. It doesn't have them in Spain or Portugal, in Britain, in Scotland. It doesn't have them in Turkey even these days in the way that it used to. Normally you have NATO practicing existential deterrence. Through its political commitments and through occasional exercises, it just brings the message, these countries belong to us, so please don't even think about it. And as long as you, the Russians, don't even think about it, we don't have to ram this down your throats that this is NATO territory. We're not going to extend the area of our exercises or bring them right up into your waters. We're not going to do anything provocative. Actually, I think the Russians understand this perfectly well. They're not denying that Norway and Iceland and Denmark and therefore Greenland and Canada and the US belong to NATO. They're just saying, don't do anything more obvious about it. And for NATO not to do anything more obvious, I would argue, is exactly typical of the way that NATO behaves on its other peripheries, except mainly in the Baltic area, and especially since Ukraine. But the Baltic area is the odd one out, I would argue, from this point of view, and for very good reasons. And the fact that the military, any military build-up, any military business that goes on there in the northern periphery, that it's there mainly to help in civil tasks, search and rescue, monitoring and that kind of thing, is actually typical of other peripheries of Europe. If you looked at what NATO ships are doing in the Mediterranean, a lot of the time they're searching for terrorists smuggling weapons or weapons of mass destruction, or they're trying to deal with migration from North Africa. They're not actually there preparing to go to war with Russia every day. So this kind of use of military assets for civil tasks is not unusual either. And it is being pursued in quite a logical way, I would say, on the Arctic frontier. And finally, the importance of sub-regional organisations. Now, what do I mean by sub-regional organisations? Well, simply neighbourhood groups of states who are together with land frontiers, or they're grouped together around a sea area, and they cooperate. And Europe has been very, very fruitful in developing these sub-regional groups, often going across the borders of integration, so that you can include states who are still candidates, and you can include states like Russia or Belarus who don't actually have an ambition of joining the EU and NATO. And the Arctic, or the Atlantic gateway to the Arctic, is absolutely full of sub-regional organisations. It's typical of Europe, but it's particularly well developed in European terms, I would say, because up here you have the group of the 5 Nordic states who have certain common Arctic policies. You have West Nordic cooperation, which is just beginning to be better known. It's the cooperation of Iceland, Greenland and the Faroes. It's growing very fast at the moment. You have the Barents Euro-Arctic Council, which began mainly as a kind of Norwegian, Finnish, Russian cooperation on those high land frontiers in the north of Scandinavia. It celebrated its 10 years anniversary last year. It's been very successful in my view. You have the EU's Northern Dimension, which includes Russia, Norway and Iceland, and puts a lot of money into the region, by the way. And you have functional groups. I mean, the ones I've mentioned so far are for general economic and soft security cooperation, but you also have specialised groups like the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission, which at the moment is being used as a basis and a model for trying to extend fisheries control further up into the Antarctic. You have groups for Coast Guard cooperation and all that kind of thing. Just to underline that this is a case of the European architecture spilling over into the Arctic, you have nothing like this around the Bering Strait. You have nothing like this on the other side of the globe. You have a little bit of fisheries and Coast Guard cooperation, but you have none of these interstate or intergovernmental councils. And then, of course, partly inspired by the Barents Council and the Council of Baltic Sea States, you have the formalization of the Arctic Council in 1996, based on a previous less formal or less governmental environmental cooperation. And the Arctic Council is often called weak or inadequate, particularly by US analysts. But in fact, its strengths and weaknesses are exactly the same as all of those other regional organizations. And I have written an article with a very detailed comparison that you can find online, but they're exactly the same in that they don't try to deal with military problems, they don't try to deal with territorial disputes, they don't have the competence to manage economic development, but what they do is ensure cooperation in low politics or soft security, or the development of basic norms, such as a treaty that they have there now on search and rescue cooperation, common response to oil spills. They were behind the development of this new shipping code. They're encouraging solutions on fisheries. And you can talk there about the indigenous peoples, health, culture, all that kind of thing. The indigenous peoples sit on the Arctic Council, the small countries sit on the Arctic Council, and it's one of the vehicles of ownership and of influences coming from the bottom up and not just from the top down. And by doing all of that is actually covering about 90% of the real problems in the Arctic. If I'm right in thinking that the outbreak of war is not going to happen, then about 90% of what is left are exactly those low politics or soft security areas for cooperation that the Arctic Council is dealing with. So to sum up, it's certainly time to move on. I would readily agree that there is no single strong institution exclusively belonging to the Arctic. And I would also readily agree that the Arctic as such is not a postmodern sphere of integration or potential integration, given that half of the Arctic is Russian, given that another large part is US and Canada, and these are not countries that will become part of a wider European Union. National jurisdictions, national territorial presence remains the main basis for exerting the rule of law, for good or ill, and I would say that it does have its good points, given that these are not weak or disorderly states. However, we do find there a typically European picture of multiple overlapping institutions, legal frameworks, and other instruments of governance. It's messy. There is clearer governance for some purposes, let's say search and rescue or environmental standards, than there is in some other areas. It's messy. But I would argue that the whole larger European space is messy, the whole transatlantic space is messy, and yet it is the most advanced, the most peaceful, the best integrated area in the world. And I think that spreads into the European Arctic, and the European part of the Arctic is much better for it. Now, where does the EU fit in as such? Well, I've already given you the facts. This is a semi-integrated frontier with some rich and powerful states who are not fully integrated and apparently don't want to be. The Icelandic government has frozen its negotiations for membership, and at the moment there is only, I think, 35% in an opinion poll this week for seeing the EU as a positive force. So 35% of Icelanders see the EU as a positive force. That may seem very low. Only 33% of Icelanders see the present government as a positive force. So you can read those numbers whichever way round you like. But I think it would be wrong to predict Icelandic membership anytime soon, and I suspect we will never have membership for the Faroes and Greenland, given their very special positions. However, there are very strong partnerships. Through the European Economic Area, Norway and Iceland, together with, of course, Liechtenstein and Switzerland, are the most fully integrated of the EU's neighbours. There is an increasingly important partnership with Greenland, which goes with restructuring and modernisation of EU funding for Greenland, which is not much less than 10% of Greenland's overseas earnings, so it is quite important. The EU has been evolving an Arctic strategy. All the institutions have been involved, and many people outside Europe make the mistake of first reading the European Parliament documents. Of course, they are not binding, however exciting and sexy they may be. But we now have two sets from 2010 and 2014 of Council conclusions. The Council calls this a policy rather than a strategy. It's still very prudent. It's still taking differential positions on different issues. But it is, I think, reasonably coherent. And I will come to it right away in a moment. The point I would stress on this slide is that the EU has lots of money being poured into the various branches and tools of its strategy, and certainly more money than is available to any of those neighbourhood groups that I talked about before. And finally, the EU is a member of the Barents Euro-Arctic Council. It is the owner of the Northern Dimension, and it is still seeking observership in the Arctic Council, and certainly making its presence very well known there, regardless of which seat it belongs in. Now, here you have a list which maybe you could look at in detail later, because I don't want to talk it through fully. On the left, you have the text that the Commission and the High Representative for CFSP published in 2012, where they, I think, had learned from previous problems where the Arctic states didn't entirely like their tone of voice. So this time they started out with a very virtuous approach. Climate change, apply useful knowledge, EU research knowledge should be free to everybody. Be very careful about resource use, possibly even have a moratorium on fishing. Actually, that annoyed most of the Arctic states, but it sounds good, sounds idealistic. And then that the EU should be engaged and should pursue dialogue with all the actors, indigenous peoples, states, and sub-regional frameworks. The Council perhaps naturally started off with a more political and institutional focus. It does talk about supporting the Arctic Council, I suppose, to make clear that it really, really wants to get a seat at the Arctic Council. But after that, it comes to very much the same. Environment monitoring, research, shipping rules, which should be designed, among other things, to ensure that ships flagged in the EU can access the Arctic on equal terms if they obey the rules, and so forth. So there is quite a large emerging literature looking at the EU role, and I think some of it is very useful, some of it less so. And typically those who have come to the subject very recently may have misunderstandings. But if I can just run through some of the common questions raised there and give you my possibly provocative and unreasonable position on them. A common question is the EU an actor in the Arctic? If I had €100 for every one of my students who was offered to write a thesis on is the EU an actor in the Arctic, I would be a rich woman. I always tell them, don't bother writing the thesis on it, because the answer is yes, and that's the end of the story, and it's actually not a very interesting question. Is the EU a newcomer? Does it make mistakes because it still has things to learn? Yes. Particularly a lot of things that were said in 2008 by the Parliament, and even a few of the things said by the Commission were, I think, based on inadequate understanding, particularly of the other institutions and of the national positions. But it has been a fast learning process. I think you see much greater sophistication in the latest things coming out of the institutions. And if the EU sometimes makes mistakes, sometimes sounds a bit silly, so does everybody else. I couldn't tell you any other institution that gets it right all the time, even the Arctic Council itself. Is the main thing that the EU should be aiming at to win its long-standing fight for observership in the Arctic Council? I think we should admit that that is one of the least important things for the long-term influence and stake of the EU and its countries in Arctic development. Because the Arctic Council, as we've discussed, only deals with a limited range of topics, particularly those that deal with human development and soft security are of greatest interest to people in the Arctic Circle. You can't pretend that they affect Europeans in the Mediterranean equally. And so you're in an institute with limited leverage, and if you're an observer, you have limited leverage within the institution. The EU has many other ways to get what it wants in the Arctic, through the extension of its own legislative base, through the EEA and its partnerships, through its spending, just by buying the friends that it wants or the programs that it wants, by all kinds of partnerships and extensions of its other policies, for instance, the extension of EU-Russia policies. What should be the EU's priorities? Well, I have no quarrel with either of these lists. I think it's fairly obvious what the priorities are, and they match with those types of broader European involvement that I gave you earlier. Perhaps what is not really explicit in these institutional agendas is working for peace, but I don't think the EU is really working against peace either. And to me, the sort of balance or the restraint that keeps the peace is the business of NATO. And I think NATO and EU are sensible enough these days to have a division of labour between them where it makes sense. And I think it actually makes sense in the Arctic as well. Has the EU coordinated its various instruments and policies, and is it giving the right money in the right place? Of course not. There isn't any area of EU policy where it's properly coordinated or giving enough resources, and that is particularly true in areas of external policy. Of course not. But it still may be doing better than many other institutions, and what the EU has to give is so significant that even if it's at, say, 60% efficiency, it's still going to make a difference in the Arctic. Is the EU, in political terms, making the best use of individual member states, of individual partners? The really weird thing is, and here, since we're getting near the end, allow me to be a little tactless. If I was asked which of the Nordic states has really made the best input to EU Arctic policies, I would say Norway. Norway was certainly leaning over the Commission's shoulder in the original documents of 2008-2009. It has the biggest stake, the biggest expertise, particularly in oil and gas, but also very successful border handling with Russia. Finland, of course, is in a position to give a huge amount, but for Finland, the Arctic agenda is a relatively small amount of Finland's overall agenda. It's a bilateral agenda with Russia, it's a Baltic agenda. Sweden doesn't, I have to say, have particular Arctic expertise except in mining, where that could actually be quite important. And for Denmark, managing the drawdown of the Danish Empire, the final permutations in the relations with Greenland and the Faroes, is a very, very sensitive issue. And I think Denmark is very keen to keep that under its own control and not Europeanize or not EUize its Arctic policy too greatly. I have every sympathy with that, and I don't think it will prejudice the outcome. So there is a little bit of a problem, or maybe a kind of political vacuum here, in as much as the larger EU members have been quite slow to decide where they stand on the Arctic issue and to start offering some kind of leadership which would be informed by the Nordic countries, but which would make up such gaps or vacuums or divided views as the Nordics themselves have left. Germany is starting to do this. Poland, rather surprisingly, is starting to do it. There's a lot of very good academic work coming out of Poland just now, but the UK and France, I think, are still underplaying their possible roles. France is supposed to publish an Arctic strategy quite soon. There has been a very good report by the Sénat, a sort of almost 200-page report as a basis for that, and maybe something will change there. So those are my short answers. And I promise this will just be the last few minutes. I want to come back to the larger questions I asked about the importance of this frontier for the future of Europe. Well, that depends, of course, on what will happen in the Arctic more generally. People always ask me to commit myself on the future, and I'm very reluctant to do this, but here are my best guesses. I think commercial development will be much slower than expected, and in particular the oil and gas exploitation and cargo shipping will be slow. I think we will see more happening in mining, possibly in communications. There is, for instance, a plan to do an optical cable all the way under the Arctic, which is very interesting, and, of course, tourism. At the same time, I think the damage from climate change will be faster than expected. It is happening, and we haven't yet put together the picture to see just how powerful these damaging forces are, but they can only grow. And so the question to me is not how will we curb the race for the Arctic, but how will we get enough economic players to put in serious investment in time to start earning income that will offset the climate damage? That's the way I actually see the development conundrum. I do not see war coming out of the Arctic. There is no sensible analysis that will give you that. Rather, I see that our tensions with Russia outside the Arctic may slow down the rational cooperation and undermine the sense of trust which has up to now mostly prevailed with Russia in Arctic management. Concretely, there have been sanctions that have stopped the armed forces up there talking to each other about how to fulfill their civilian tasks, such as their tasks in search and rescue, and that is a big shame, I think. And there have been complications to some of the West-East partnerships in oil exploration. Finally, I don't think the northern frontier of Europe will become completely integrated in EU style. And although the Arctic agenda is bringing forward some advances in Nordic group integration, there are still differences in national interest among the Nordics, even in the Arctic, which will also even slow down that local integrative effect. And the fastest integration or pooling of positions that we're seeing at the moment is actually in the small West Nordic group between Iceland, Greenland and the Faroes, where Greenland and the Faroes can practice their policy making without Danes being there. And of course, as very small political entities, they need to form a common front if anybody is going to listen to them. So if we come to the question of where does the Arctic frontier or the high northern frontier come in the destiny of Europe, any frontier may be either a bridge or a barrier, a risky area, a place where the barbarians may break in. It seems to me that if you're looking for a scary, unstable, possibly conflict-producing frontier, don't look here. I think if you look to the east, the southeast, the south, it's very much more scary. That doesn't mean that there are no risks for Europe, but I think the risks are more subtle, and I can try and illustrate them through the following line of logic. I would suggest that for Northern Europe, the high north and the Arctic is an area of bridging. There is no barrier. Many of them live up there. They've always been involved. They will continue to be involved. And other Europeans, such as the fishing nations, will continue to be involved in more specific ways. But if we're taking the Arctic development as a whole, and all those issues I've asked about where will the sustainable investment come from, how will we make better use of these interlocking institutions, the key question is it going to be only the northern Europeans and maybe some of the West Atlantic Europeans that are going to get involved in this? Or is it going to be all Europe that gets involved in some way? Now, why does that matter? I mean, it sounds like a typically academic, theoretical question, but I can give you two scenarios where it would matter. Now, if the Arctic goes sour, that is, if you get a very rapid increase in climate change damage, if you get even destruction of existing infrastructures and the lifelines that they offer for people, like all those people in northwest Russia whose supplies come across the permafrost and then it melts, or indeed if you get little local disputes, although I think that less likely, will the rest of Europe show any kind of solidarity with the North? Or will it just say, you're rich guys, you know what you're doing there, we don't have a stake, you just sort that out among yourselves? Thinking of this in the EU context, could you imagine Article 222 of the Lisbon Treaty being invoked for a major accident or climate disaster in the North? I think many of you might find that a little bit strange. But if that solidarity isn't going to be there, obviously it's a problem for the North when it needs help, but it does create a dividing line in Europe itself. The opposite strategy is that the Arctic goes well, there are profits to be made, there are intensive new patterns of activity, but then it's the North that doesn't want to share the profits with the rest of Europe. It says, what have you ever done to deserve a share of the profits? We will strengthen our local institutions. The Arctic Council will become stronger and will not need the EU to help it particularly. Then I guess the people in the south could be a bit aggrieved. They would want to get on the bandwagon. But if they have not shown interest in solidarity now, in the second decade of the 21st century, why should they expect to share in the profits? And then, bearing in mind that southern and eastern Europe will continue to be next to very much more dangerous borders, and will be much more reliant on Arab oil and Russian oil, while the Arctic countries are becoming more self-sufficient in their energy supplies, you could get another very interesting strategic division, which could even be quite dangerous for the survival of Europe. So it may seem a little far-fetched to you, but I do think that when we're considering the need for the EU to have an Arctic policy, we should bear these larger questions involved as well as the specialised ones. But to be fair, and this goes back to a remark I made just a few minutes ago, I also don't think that it's fair or realistic to expect the European Union as such to master these dilemmas or these scenarios for the future of Europe's Arctic frontier. I think it's something that all Europeans and all the relevant European institutions should work on together. So I hope that's a good place to stop, and thank you very much for staying awake and staying with me. Thank you.